So greetings, hello, this is Dr. Thomas Daffern. Now today is an unusual day. I'm recording this talk to honour St Matthew's Day. It's September the 21st, which is the autumn equinox. And it's one of the most important days in the Christian calendar, really, as far as I'm concerned. Because as a biblical scholar and a lover of the Bible, I've done commentaries on all the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke and John, which are in the Bible, that are in every church everywhere in the world. And if you read Matthew's Gospel, it really is quite mind-blowing. Very deep stuff. I've done a detailed commentary on it, which is on my Green University website. And it's full of interesting stuff, which I will be commenting on shortly. And today being his day, I thought I would combine this and begin a training course, which is aimed mainly at Christian clergy. So if you are a vicar, or a monk, or a Christian clergy, or a reader, or whatever in the church, of any denomination, this talk is mainly aimed at you. And I will be addressing the question of Bremain as founder of the Centre for Bremain Studies. I think this is very much in the interests of Britain. I'm speaking at a critical time. It's Saturday, the 21st of September, at a time when the Supreme Court has just heard whether the Prime Minister illegally advised the Queen to suspend Parliament, proroga as it's called, which effectively suspend it. This raises such huge constitutional questions for our country. The Supreme Court are actually deliberating this as we speak. And I pray and hope that they will realise this was actually an illegal action and that Parliament will get back. And we can figure out some way of solving this terrible crisis that's affected the entire country. I care passionately about stopping Brexit. I think it's the worst idea since as long as I've been alive, politically speaking. I studied political philosophy as part of my degree at the University of London. I've been head of citizenship at many schools in the UK. And I'm appalled at the low level of educational attainment that underlies the Brexit phenomena. As a teacher, I think it's a shocking expose of the poverty of our school system and its lack of citizenship education. Sir Bernard Crick, who I knew, founded the Citizenship Studies Association for Teachers. I was at one of its founding conferences. I met him, and I take citizenship studies very seriously. It is legally compulsory in all schools, but of course schools simply neglect it, and inspectors just kind of rubber stamp, oh well, they're teaching a bit of, geography, history and all that, they're covering it. No, it should be a discrete subject. And there the kids would learn about the politics of the United Kingdom, our constitution, our voting system, and our responsibilities. The history of the EU, why we're members, the history of the UN, why we helped set that up, and so on. But in fact, no, it's all not happening. So this, to me, is part of the failure of the UK education system that enabled this tragedy to take place. Now, I'm particularly mindful that in some parts of the country, there are significant swathes of Christian voters who seem to think that theologically Brexit is, what God intends, that it's theologically a sound project. And some clergy have even said this. I've seen reports of clergy, sticking their head above the parapet saying, yes, Brexit is a great idea. Now, I'm going to challenge that in this course, which I'm starting today on September the 21st. I'm going to be arguing, as a Christian thinker and theologian, steeped in the universal church history and traditions, that, on the contrary, Brexit is a diabolic project, and it's managed to seduce and entrance people into, literally a form of possession, actually, which I think is what's happened to the country, as I will explain. So my intention is to do a talk as part of this ongoing course on each of the major saints' days. So today it's St Matthew's Day. I'm going to do a course on St Mark's Day, St John's Day, St Luke's Day. but also St. Thomas's Day and St. Mary Magdalene, because they're also the fifth and sixth Gospels that I think should be in the traditional Gospel, the New Testament. I think St. Thomas's Gospel, found recently, just after World War II, is of vital importance, and also St. Mary Magdalene's. In my commentaries, I've gone into great detail on these, and Professor of New Testament Studies and Anglican theologian at the University of Oxford has also done a commentary on Mary Magdalene's Gospel, which I've used. And of course, I founded the Mary Magdalene Studies Association here in France, so I'm very interested in the Gnostic traditions, as people know, as well as the Catholic and the Orthodox and the Anglican and so on. So I'm speaking as an Anglican layperson. I'm not a vicar in the Church of England. I've never had time to train. But I'm speaking having studied for years and years and years, and sat at the feet of many great theologians. Some are dead. I believe that this is a spiritual challenge to the country, to the UK, and indeed to the whole of Europe. Because I'm one of those people that sees spirituality as more important than politics, and that politics should be answerable to spirituality. What do I mean by that? Well, I mean moral codes, moral judgments, ethics, right and wrong, good and evil, these bigger order questions, truth and lies and so on. These are fundamental. These are oxygen as souls, basically, as human beings in incarnation. That's true in all the world's systems of religion. That's true if I was a Hindu rishi or a Buddhist Zen teacher in Japan, or a Jain monk in Jaipur, or a American Indian shaman, or Sufi teaching in Jerusalem, or a rabbi in Tel Aviv, whatever. The fundamental united message of all these traditions is that ethics takes precedence over the search for power. Right and wrong, good and evil, ensuring that you pursue the path of virtue is the fundamental task we have as human beings. It's much more important than how much we have in our bank, or whether we're going to, achieve this or that external secular power in our lives. That's the sum total of all the great traditions of philosophical wisdom, which I've documented and catalogued in my periodic table of the world's religions and philosophies. It's why Socrates was martyred, because that's what he was telling the citizens of Athens. And ultimately, it's why Christ was martyred, as we'll see. So that's why I think, from a Brexit perspective, my teaching is about how the ethical fundament, the architectonic, to use Kant's phrase, that underlies reality, points to Bremain as the ethical choice. And the problem is that, of course, people who haven't studied ethics, who haven't studied philosophy, who haven't thought these things through, who have no language to counter the propaganda that comes at them mercilessly from the media, from the tabloids, from the Daily Telegraph and so on, and the internet, where it's paid for by military style propagandists. There isn't the equipment to counter it, and so they fall in with the herd. They fall in with the masses that are screaming Brexit, Brexit. But that's only happening. It's only happening in England, and only then in pockets in England. But it's also happening in pockets in the Christian Church. It's happening in pockets in other religions, but much less so. And I've given quite a few talks about Brexit seen from the perspective of all different religions that are on my, I believe they're on my blog, in fact. So I'm going to be talking firstly on this first opening course. This is aimed mainly at Christian clergy, but all Christians are welcome to listen, and all people of all goodwill. It's not only about Christianity. You see, in my understanding, Christ and the phenomena of Christianity is of universal interest, should be of interest to everyone on planet Earth, whatever your out of faith path. I want to share first who was St Matthew. Let me begin with that because it's his day. Now September 21st is sacred in the Druid path and the pagan traditions and all over the world among pagans and primal peoples because it's the autumnal equinox here in the Northern Hemisphere. It's when the dark and light are equally balanced and we're about to go into the dark half of the year, which winter. You know, it's sad because it's the end of summer. We've all had a great summer, I hope. I hope everyone's enjoyed it. I've certainly had some fascinating experiences, visitors, travels, etc. But now we come to the dark time, the quiet time when people go within, and this was the time when the university season starts again and people go back to Oxford and Cambridge or London and do their studies because it's the quiet time. Harvest is over, everyone gets down back to work in that inner path. And the Global Green University, my university, you know, re-begins its work. So that's as it should be, that the dark is a place of profound reflection. As Jung said, the shadow is full of, you know, enlightenment and lightning, just as cloud is full of lightning flashes. The lightning flash of wisdom comes from that dark introspection, if you want. So Matthew, why Matthew at this time of year? Well, I think it's very wise that the Universal Church fixed this as his day because the opening gospel, Matthew's gospel, is about giving hope in the midst of darkness. It's about incarnating the supreme light into a fallen, difficult, dangerous, traumatized world. And we are that. We are a traumatized world still. As I speak, you know, there's uncertainties and conflicts all over the world, in the Gulf, Yemen. It looks to me like America is beating drums of war to create conflicts in the Gulf, demonizing Iran, putting new sanctions on Iran as a proud nation, you know, threatens retaliation. We could be into World War III by the time I come to record my next talk. God forbid, you know, calm down everyone. Go into the dark time and reflect on the inner light, the inner truth. I've been a Quaker attender for many years and sat in Quaker meetings in all over the world, actually, as well as Anglican churches and Catholic churches and Protestant. You know, I mean, I regard myself as an ecumenical, universal Christian-Druid, and what I have to say today is addressed from that universal perspective. So Matthew is an important figure because he was a friend of Jesus, and his gospel, which is beautifully written, full of detail, full of stuff you don't get in the other gospels. There are two schools of thought. Some say Matthew's was the first gospel, and this is the view of some scholars, I kind of take that view, actually. I've looked into this. There was a German theologian, Griesbach, who wrote a thesis on this. There's a chap recently at Oxford who's done a PhD arguing the same thing. There is a strong argument that Matthew's was the first gospel. It makes sense because he was a learned Jewish guy living up in the north of the Sea of Galilee. He was working for the local bureaucracy. He was a civil servant in the local system, which meant that he had to collect taxes, which is, you know, not everybody's favourite profession, and he was therefore literate. Some say he had a booth to collect tolls as people came along the road, which went from, essentially it was part of the Silk Road. It was going to the coast, probably at Caesarea, and where the great ships would sail off to Rome and Greece and so on. And it would come from, ultimately, the Persian Empire, and even beyond that, from China. And you would meet pilgrims on this road, who then had to pay a tax. It was a toll booth, especially if they were transporting carts, wagons, and so on. And his job was to make sure that everyone paid the toll. That's what is very possible, what he did, which would have meant he would have had quite a bigger perspective on affairs. And would have been a man of the world, seeing people from all over the world going back and forth on this road. he met Jesus somehow. Jesus came into his consciousness. He was obviously looking for guidance, wisdom. He was, as far as we know, someone interested in the inner teachings of Judaism. He was interested in, he was literate, so he'd studied what we now call the Old Testament, the Torah, in depth. He was particularly interested in the prophets. He quotes from them all the time. And he was really looking for the fulfillment of Judaism, the promise. He believed this pointed to a messianic kind of Judaism, which most intelligent Jews at the time would have concurred with. He probably knew the writings of Enoch, which were circulating in those circles, and that promised a kind of coming Son of Man was the phrase in the Enochian tradition, not the Messiah, the Son of God. That wasn't used. It was the Son of Man, because to be the Son of Man is an important enough title. It means that you identify with all humanity. You identify with your humanness. And that phrase is in Enoch, which was already written by this time, Enoch 1. So it's circulating among people like Matthew and Jesus and the early community that came together and eventually called themselves Christians. They didn't at the time of Christ, because Christ kept his messianic mission secret. What you learn in Matthew of some very interesting things, you learn about how Mary had this inner revelation and conceived through the Holy Spirit this very special child. You learn that Joseph was her husband-to-be. They were engaged, or betrothed as they called it, was therefore minded to put her away. He didn't want to marry her. He thought she'd been unfaithful. And then he had a dream in which it was revealed to him that actually she'd not been unfaithful. There was something very weird that happened, supernatural. She'd conceived of the Holy Spirit. And Joseph had enough trust in the divine to accept that, which is pretty extraordinary, actually. I mean, if my consort said that, I'd struggle to believe it. But he had this dream, which for the esoteric Jews like Joseph and Matthew, that was proof enough. The Bible is full of the dreaming power of the Jewish people. If you think of, many great people have dreams in the Bible, and you could rewrite the whole Bible from the perspective of dream analysis, which is something that Jung and Freud all agreed on, the power of dream. So really, Christianity came into being because of a dream. It's as simple as that. It is a dream, and that gave Joseph confidence in his beloved Mary, and he stood by her. Then he had another dream after the baby was born that he had to take the family to Egypt because Herod was coming to kill them all. And after they'd gone, the three Magi come, and they only appear in Matthew. It's very interesting. To me, that's Matthew signing, look, this Christ is part of a universal wisdom brotherhood project. It's not, Christ don't appear out of nowhere. They come with a matrix of backup supporters. Listen to my own past life regression stuff that I've shared, and you'll see what I mean by that. And so Christ was part of this backup team, of which the three Magi were important figures. We have to assume there are some mysteries going on behind the scenes that we're not fully aware of here. But Matthew is sensitive enough to the mystery traditions that he puts this in. The Magi in the Gaelic Gospel is translated as Druids. So three Druids appear mysteriously just after Jesus is born and say, we've come to celebrate the birth of this very, very special child. What a magical thing to happen, and then it's a dream that tells Joseph to take the family, including the baby, down to Egypt for safety. That shows us several things. A, Matthew has access to some very important information because this story is not really in the other Gospels. Secondly, that Joseph probably Mary possibly, were in touch with the Jewish community in probably Alexandria in Egypt, which was a very large Jewish community, very intellectual. They were friends with the people that ran the museum in Alexandria. They were friends with scholars, philosophers, Neoplatonists. They were friends with people like Philo, who was the great Jewish thinker, the savant in Alexandria. This is very interesting. I think it's almost certain, if you really study this matter, as I've done, that Joseph and Mary had colleagues, friends, contacts, mentors in Alexandria, certainly in Egypt, among the most intelligent of the Jewish diaspora at the time, who were working on a synthesis of biblical stuff and an esoteric, philosophical, Platonic, Neoplatonic theories about the soul and life and the survival of the soul and so on. This later became, it took form as what we call the Kabbalah, and also as Gnosticism and also as Neoplatonism. These three were all swirling around if you were in the library in Alexandria at the time Joseph turns up and baby Jesus and Mary are down the road and he's doing some studying. It's not beyond possibility. Certainly he would have been part of a circle that were doing that. And don't forget, the Library of Alexandria had translated the entire Bible into Greek by then, so they knew the text. Philo was trying to reconcile Platonism with the entire Bible. He was doing commentaries on it and so on. What I think Joseph and Mary and later Jesus and Matthew and the other disciples are trying to do was to apply that into the context of the everyday catastrophe that is political, military power structures. And by the courage and power of Christ's teachings, he was trying to bring that truth to bear on the unjust military-industrial complex of his day. He was a peace activist, an intellectual peace activist, with some of the greatest teachers and influences on him. So Matthew, I think, is a guide through this. Then he says, well, they go back and he teaches. And then, Matthew takes you through the life of Jesus and his teachings and the Beatitudes and so on. My daughter has just been to the Mount of the Beatitudes in the north of the Lake of Galilee, overlooking the lake, a most beautiful place which I went to way back in, I think, 95. I was very, very struck by its beauty, and I think it gives you a feeling of Christ as someone from from the perspective of Jerusalem, he's someone from the margins. He's a country bumpkin from Galilee, but actually he was from cosmic consciousness, because what you get if you're on the Mount of the Beatitudes and you do deep meditation and it's sunset and you watch the lake is actually this is a cosmically beautiful place. This is a place brimming with energy, compared to the corrupt city of Jerusalem, which is a sort of almost like a Hollywood set. It's a kind of fake thing, which is full of violence, conflict, war, aggression, misogyny, greed, and it is now and it was then. They can't agree on anything virtually. Whereas when you're on the Mount of Beatitudes, it's all peace. You can hear the birds singing, and you can always hear the fish flopping in the lake, and you can feel Cyprus over there on the right, home of the goddess, Persia, India, China over there, just down the Silk Road, and you're part of the family of humanity. That's where I think Christ was teaching from. His inspiration also from Egypt, but also from just his psychic universality, his ability to tune into the all, the universal. Fritjof Schuon said the prayer of a saint is always a saint who prays from the all for the all. I think Christ had that faculty. So what would he think of Brexit? What would Matthew think of Brexit? Well, Matthew was a highly sophisticated, a brilliant early Christian intellectual, and from a universalist perspective he was trying to reconcile what people are now calling Judaism, as opposed to Christianity. He was on that crucial cusp when it wasn't split yet. There was just the good news that messianic consciousness of divine wisdom had broken through into the unjust power structures of this broken, fallen world of violence. And Matthew was trying to say, look, this messianic consciousness is now among us. And it is possible, even though Christ is crucified and even though he's ascended, we can still access that. He's opened a portal in the heaven worlds that we can access that enlightened consciousness. And his gospel, which he wrote, was to enable people to access it. And if, you're the salt of the world, he said, you're the light for all the world. Do not suppose I've come to abolish the law and the prophets. I didn't come to abolish, but to complete. I tell you, as long as heaven and earth endure, not a letter, not a stroke will disappear from the law. So, Matthew is revealing his interest in universal Kabbalistic understanding that the letters, the shape of the letters, the sounds of the letters, are themselves part of the sacred teaching. This is what Christ was teaching, this inner Kabbalistic wisdom of the sound precedes the letter form, and the sound is a reflection of the divine consciousness, which is the creative energy underlying all existence, and which Christ was obviously able to download and teach from. As are all true realised saints and sages, avatars, seishants, whatever you want to call them. So, yes, a great man, Matthew, making great comments. There are other things. Do not give dogs what is holy. Do not throw your pearls to the pigs. They will only trample on them and seek and tear you to pieces. Fascinating text, because it is a problem when you teach very, very profound stuff. Not everybody's at the same level to understand it. It is a problem for all teachers that know their stuff truly. Because some people don't really like to have the light shone for them. They're comfortable in their little box of narrow interpretations, and they get very upset if you flood them with kind of universal light and universal consciousness. There are various responses to that. One is what I call Sophia-phobia. The overall response is, hey, I don't want wisdom, go away. I want to stay in my little comfortable box of bourgeois domesticity or whatever it is I'm attached to. Don't trouble me, don't cause unrest. And that was a response that Christ used to get all the time, it seems, apparently. And Matthew talks about it. So what should you do? Should you then just shut up and say nothing? Should you just ignore and let people get on with their boxes? As a teacher, one doesn't have that choice. One has a duty to teach, and if you're a doctor of the church, or a doctor of wisdom, if you want, you have a moral duty to continually try and refract that light of the universal into the particular of everybody's particular circumstances. Thomas Aquinas put it using a different image than light. He said that the sage, the seer, is, as it were, on a mountaintop and can receive the rain when it falls from heaven soonest because it's closest to heaven, and it receives the rain from the skies, and you get soaked. To him, that's a metaphor of divine wisdom. And then you have to guide it down in the rivers into the plains and lowlands, where it then nourishes and so on. So Francis Bacon uses the same metaphor, where he calls it the liquor of divine knowledge. So yes, teachers have a duty, I think, to channel that universal wisdom. And this is what people are trying to do in our day. People like Ken Wilber talking about integral knowledge. In my own work as a transpersonal historian, I've tried to integrate, the metaphysics of the totality of knowledge into a wholeness that can be understood. It's what Heidegger was trying to do in his work. It's what Sri Aurobindo was doing. And it's what all truly universal thinkers do. Matthew, in his own way, knew all this. He was trying to do it, but he was writing the narrative. He was telling telling it through stories, in a sense. The man who hears these words of mine and acts upon them is like a man who had the sense to build his house on rock. The rain came down, the floods rose, the wind blew and beat upon that house, but it did not fall, because its foundations were on rock. So I lived for some years in a castle in Scotland built on rock called Craigard, and it was literally built on rock. And when I was a little boy, I went to a primary school in Kemp Town called St Matthew's, which was named after this saint. It was an Anglican primary school. I remember listening to that little parable, I was probably about 5. And you can get it. You can get it just from that little story. You can say, that's a great image. When I grow up, I want to build something enduring. I want to build on rock, not on sand. So Matthew's Gospel is lovely. It speaks to the whole range of the human condition, from the most advanced intellectual down to a 5-year-old little boy or girl. Okay, so what would he make of Brexit? I want to come now to the second part of this talk. Why am I talking about doing a training course for Christian clergy? Why am I starting that today? Well, because I'm disturbed that some people seem to think Christianity is compatible with the tragedy that is Brexit. They've obviously not been reading the same Bible I've been reading. I've studied this Bible inside out, every which way, and I've done commentaries on it, and there's nothing in this Bible, the entirety of it, or in the appendices and all the other add-ons, the apocryphals and so on, that can possibly justify Brexit. And I'm going to try and explain why. But this course is for all Christian clergy, therefore, who've wondered whether the European Union is or is not compatible with their Christian faith. So many Christians have argued that Brexit, and I've seen some of their posts and talks and so on, is a natural and good outcome of the 2016 referendum, and the argument goes that the EU is a fundamentally anti-Christian organisation. So obviously it's God's will to leave the EU. That's a simplistic summary of how some Brexit people think. My question in this course, I want to address those things, is how rational are those arguments? And how can Christian clergy learn to counter them? Let's say you're a vicar in a parish church in wherever, Neasden, and your congregation are coming to you and saying, I voted leave because the EU's an antichrist, it's the devil. Ian Paisley said it was, so it must be. They're all Catholics and they're all devil worshippers, so I'm against it, and that's why I voted leave. Well, you can't say to these people, well, you're just wrong, and you have to be able to explain where the wrongness lies and what is wrong about that position. And there are different ways of doing that. So I'm going to run through that during this course, which I'll be focusing each of these major saints' days. Because the Christian vicar or teacher has a duty to stand with the person. It's not like, I don't like you because you're a Brexiteer. It's, I love you because you're a child of God. I think you're mistaken, and I think I understand how you're mistaken at getting to that view that, the EU is evil and we have to leave it. And I think I can explain that it's probably a mistaken view because it has consequences which are worse than staying in, far, far worse. And consequences which do actually have truly anti-Christian consequences. So logically, it can't be a Christian thing to embark on a set of actions that are going to end in the impoverishment of the country and the breakup of the country. Scotland, Northern Ireland, severing from the UK. That can't be in the mission statement of good Christians, because it would cause catastrophe